Thank you so much. It's great to be back. I've enjoyed being on campus today. It always looks different no matter when I come back. I always feel like another part of town's been taken over, and so it's good to see, and it's been great to connect with some folks. Brevity is not my strong suit, so I am going to try to get rolling. I am from the Northeast, from Jersey, and I talk fast. So I feel like I'm always having tech issues, so I'm always a little bit behind. So I hope you'll track with me. So today, kind of just to give you a brief where we're headed, I was asked to give a bit of context on my study, on the research, kind of how I came to this topic, which I always love to hear people's stories about how they get into what they get into. Because anyone, I'm sure many of you know, if you had a PhD, I always tell people do something you don't mind reading about on Friday night, because you will be reading about it on Friday night. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and then about the study. I'm going to really briefly hit some highlights from the key findings, and hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A. So the context of From Single to Serious, Parker Palmer talks about this idea that subjects choose us in his book, The Courage to Teach. And that's essentially how I feel about my subject. So he talks about being drawn to a body of knowledge because it sheds light on our identity, as well as the world and its way of naming and framing life. And that pretty much sums up how I came to this topic. It found me in an academic sense, but it's been a part of my journey all the way through. I kind of sometimes, people ask, well, how did you get into this? And so it dates back before my freshman year, but I love to tell the MRS degree story from my freshman year. I'm from North Jersey. My family is first generation. My parents are first generation here. So I did not spend much time outside New York and New Jersey until I came to the university. And so lots of culture shock for me and for a lot of things. And so I didn't grow up with the MRS degree joke. So I came to campus, and people were always, and so this is funny now, what I study. People were always talking about this MRS degree, and everybody seemed to be in on this inside joke. And I'm slow on the uptake, as my brothers always want to remind me, no matter how many degrees I am. They're like, how many degrees do you have? So I didn't get it. I kept thinking it was a master's degree, but I couldn't figure out which master's degree. I just wasn't aware of. And it was a solid 2 years into my time here before I finally got the joke, because it just wasn't part of my cultural experience growing up. And it was just assumed everybody knew what we were talking about. But I remember my freshman year, my roommate, we were unpacking, and she put up this picture above her bed, and it was from a magazine, and it was a wedding dress. And I kind of asked her about it, and it seemed odd to me. And she was like, oh, this is like my dream dress. And I was like, oh, okay. I wasn't sure where I was on marriage at that point. I literally had never opened a bridal magazine at that point in my life. And so for a lot of people, the MRS degree is kind of a caricature of people who attend, women especially, who attend evangelical schools, right? They're here to get the MRS degree. It's kind of a joke everybody makes. And for a lot of folks, that's the summation of how they think about relationships and gender on evangelical schools. Well, for me, that was the beginning. I knew there was more to this story. Then I spent 4 years here as a student. I worked at 2 different schools. I lived in for 7 years with students in the residence hall. I did that both as a single person, and my husband and I did it together for 4 years. So I spent a lot of hours and a lot of time talking with students about relationships, about friendships, about just all those things. Those are really pivotal conversations for them at this time. And so I knew there was more to this story, and so I was always fascinated with relationships. And then when it came time to do my doc work, I knew that I wanted to do something around that area. And I found a home at the University of Kentucky. I met with who ended up becoming my chair. Before I even applied to the program, she was very excited about my potential project, and so we got to work together, and it was a great opportunity for me to kind of bring together all of those interests and ideas that I had in an academic way. So I'm just going to briefly talk to you a little bit about the study itself. It is based on my dissertation research, and I was, as I said, my advisor was really forward-thinking, and we approached the dissertation as a book, so I didn't have to do a completely traditional dissertation and then totally rework it. We kind of approached it that way from the get-go. It was a qualitative study, so I basically did 2 sites. I did very in-depth work at 2 sites, small and large evangelical U. They were very similar in a lot of ways, both evangelical schools with the mission of Christ-centered, seamless faith and learning. But there was a lot of cultural differences, largely related to size, which is why I kind of made the names size related. So as people read the book, they can kind of have a sense of which one I was talking about. They didn't have to remember, was that the big one, was that the small one? And I won't go into all that now, just for time's sake. So my research methods, I did focus groups at both sites, and then I did in-depth individual interviews with students. I did all that now, just for time's sake. So my research methods, I did focus groups at both sites, and then I did in-depth individual interviews with students. I did all that now, just for time's sake. So my research students, I did all that now, just for time's sake. So my research students, I did all that now, just for time. Students, I did all that now, just for time. Students, I did all that now, just for time. 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 All that now, just for time.
And many grammarians do, that there really are only two basic tenses, past and present, because we form the future tense using an auxiliary, a special auxiliary. So like if we had past, we would have walked. Present would be walk, or walks if it's third person singular. And then in the future we would have will walk. And so the argument that the book makes is that because we're adding this modal auxiliary in order to form the future tense, it's not a tense in the same way that past and present are. But I think this is a distinction that actually isn't very helpful, because we do think in terms of time for all three types of time, right? Past, present, and future. And I don't think it's helpful to students to have future be kind of left out of the equation. So I'm just going to refer to these all three as tenses, even though we have to use an auxiliary in order to form the future tense. All right, so we have past, present, and future in terms of time. Makes sense. It kind of fits with our reality. But then we have, in addition to talking about time, we have something I've already mentioned once or twice today, and that is aspect. And we have two basic aspects when we're talking about verbs. And the one of those aspects is the perfect aspect, and the other is progressive Okay, perfect and progressive. Now in English, we form these aspects using auxiliary verbs. So if we're doing perfect, we're going to have a form of the verb have plus a past participle form of the verb. All right, so we have plus past participle, and that gives us perfect aspect. So again, like have walked or have lived or have eaten, all of these are examples of perfect aspect. And the progressive aspect, we also have an auxiliary verb that works together to form the progressive, and that is the be verb plus a present participle. Okay, a present participle. So if we're talking about what we're doing at this present moment, I am teaching. So am being a form of the verb to be, plus the present participle form, teaching, ing form. And that shows us, as this title indicates, it shows us that the action is kind of ongoing, or that we're thinking of it in terms of kind of duration or progress, rather than something that's kind of a completed action or something that's definite in the past. Now, with perfect and progressive aspects in English, these things get a little bit cloudy when we actually put them all together, and so it's not always that there's a perfect distinction in how we're perceiving the action. It gets a little bit complicated, and this is especially true for non-native speakers of English language who find verb tenses to be and aspects to be just incredibly difficult to master. But we have these two different aspects. All right, so if we're going to talk about tense and we're going to talk about aspect, we have to merge these together in order to get what we do in English with these different verb forms. And the thing that we see in English is that tense and aspect function hand in hand together. You can't really separate them from each other. And that's why people often, when they refer to tense, they mean both tense and aspect. Again, we're trying to be a little more precise because this is a class about grammar. But in real life, if you're talking to your students and, if they're high school students or something, and you talk about the 12 tenses in English, you're really talking about tense and aspect combinations, but everybody understands what you mean, or if they don't understand, it's okay if they don't understand. All right, so let's look at how we put these things together, the different options that we have. And so if we are going to talk about tense and aspect together, then we, excuse me, trying to find my place in the book here. We need to look at all of the different possibilities. All right, so we're going to start here with simple tenses. And these are tenses without aspect, all right, where we're not including perfect or progressive. So one column we have just looks at past, present, and future. And it's just about time. It's not about adding in the aspect. So if we have a simple past form of the word walked, for example, then we're going to have walked, right? Simple past of the word break would be broke. All right, if we have, just to give us an example of a regular and an irregular, if we have simple present of walk, we're going to have walk, but we can also have walks. Right, so we can have walk when we're talking about yourself or talking to someone you're directly addressing, you walk. But if you're talking about somebody that's a third person, a name or he, she, or it, then it's going to be walks with that S ending on there, as we've talked about in our last session. All right, so we have walk, walks, or break and breaks. Okay, so that's simple present. And then with simple future, as we mentioned before, we have to add in some kind of an auxiliary in order to form the future. And so we get will walk and will break. Okay, so those are our simple options, and that's pretty straightforward. It's not too bad. Then we are going to start mixing in aspect with this. And so we have our progressive tenses, tense aspect combinations. So when it's just progressive, then we have, let's start with the present. We have a form of the verb to be plus the ing form. And the be verb, the auxiliary verb, is the one that's going to be in present tense. So we would have like am walking, or are breaking. All right, so we get this be verb in present tense plus the ing form. So that is present progressive tense, if you want to use that terminology. All right, but if we have past progressive, we're going to have the same format, be plus ing form, but we're going to have a past tense form of the verb to be. Here, was walking and were breaking. All right, so a past tense form of the auxiliary, the be auxiliary, makes this past progressive. If we're going to do future progressive, not surprisingly, we're going to have will as our auxiliary. So we have will, and then because be still needs to be in there to give us progressive, we're going to have will be walking and will be breaking. All right, so that is simple past, present, and future, and then past progressive, present progressive, and future progressive. Okay, our third category, then our third column, is going to be about the perfect aspect. Perfect aspect. And when we have perfect aspect, then we're going to have the auxiliary, as we said before, the auxiliary have, and the auxiliary have is going to go together with the past participle. So we're going to have walked, or have broken. And here we see that irregular participle form from break. Okay, so have broken, have walked. This is the perfect aspect. Oops, I'm sorry, I got the present tense one there instead of the past tense, because here we're going to add the past tense form, right? So it's going to be had walked and had broken. Sorry for that little confusion there. I hope you caught that error. All right, then in terms of present perfect, we're going to have walked and have broken. And then future perfect is going to be will have walked and will have broken. Okay, so when we're doing future, we're just adding in this auxiliary will in addition to the auxiliary we have to form the aspect that we want. So we have will have walked, will have broken. All right, so these are our simple tenses, and then progressive aspect, perfect aspect. And now, of course, the way things work in English, it's always like this, we can put everything together and we get perfect progressive, right? So we can have past perfect progressive, we can have present perfect progressive, and we can have future perfect progressive. So let's, we're going to have to erase our board here to have some room. to talk about this combination form, but we end up with perfect progressive form. All right, perfect progressive. So now we still have past, present, and future. And our present perfect progressive is going to be have been walking or have been breaking. All right, so we have our present perfect progressive. And what we notice here is that we have the have auxiliary for the perfect part. And so that's have. But then we also have a past participle of the be verb, which gives us the complete perfect part of the aspect, right? So we have been, that part's perfect. But then we have be as the progressive part of the equation together with the ing form over here. So we end up with been walking, giving us that progressive aspect as well. So we have both perfect and progressive. Now there's overlap here in the middle with this be verb, because it is both the past participle to form the perfect and the auxiliary to form the progressive at the same time. They kind of overlap like that and build on each other. So that's important to keep track of. Now if we're going to past perfect progressive, then we're just going to make the first auxiliary into past tense. So we would have had been walking and had been breaking. All right, and we don't bump into this that often. Most people don't use it all that often, but it does get used occasionally. And then for future, we get, as you would expect, will have been walking or will have been breaking. All right, now one thing you need to notice here is that now we have this auxiliary will for the future tense. We have been for the perfect, and then we have been walking for the progressive. So there's this kind of overlap here as we were talking about just a moment ago. All right, so these are the 12 different options that we have in terms of tense and aspect combinations. We can have simple, present, past, and future. We can have present perfect, future perfect, past perfect. We can have present progressive, past progressive, future progressive. And then we can put it all together and have all three with perfect progressive together. Okay, so these are our 12 basic options when it comes to using tenses. Now some tenses, some tense and aspect combinations are used way more than others. These last ones, like future perfect progressive, is pretty rare that people have an occasion to use it, but it still does happen occasionally. All right, so let's stop for a moment then and talk about auxiliaries. We've been mentioning them numerous times already, but let's just quickly review what we have in English in terms of auxiliaries. So, all right, when we're talking about auxiliaries, we have, first of all, modals, modal auxiliaries, and we've talked about these before. So these are words like can, could, would, should, etc. So there's a bunch of them, but it is a limited set. There aren't that many of them. And these do not change the form of the verb that follows them. So whenever you have one of these, the thing that's going to follow it is going to be the base form of the verb. So will walk, you're just going to have walk after will, or should walk, you're going to have walk after should. So those are modal auxiliaries. Then we have the auxiliary have, and as we've seen, have plus past participle makes perfect aspect, right? Gives us perfect aspect. So the have is going to work in that capacity as a helping verb. Now the verb have can also be a main verb in a sentence, right? Like I have a book, meaning that a book is possessed by me, right? In my possession. So have is a quite frequent main verb, but we're talking about when have is used in conjunction with a past participle of another verb, and we get things like have walked or have lived and so on. All right, then we have, as we've seen already, we have the be verb, which gives us be plus present participle for progressive aspect, right? For progressive aspect. So is walking, was walking, for example. We have a form of the verb to be, and then we have the present participle, which is the ing form. Now, once again, the be verb can also be a main verb. And when a be verb is a main verb, then we're going to have sentence patterns 1, 2, or 3. Because those are our be verb sentence patterns, right? So if we have a sentence like, the king is happy, then is there is the main verb of the sentence, and it is not an auxiliary. But if I say the king is sleeping, then it's just an auxiliary that's giving me progressive aspect of the verb sleep. And so you have to keep these straight when we have an auxiliary or when we have a main verb for have or be. All right, then we also have another form of the verb be used as an auxiliary, and this is where we realize that be is really doing a huge job in our language. It's way overworked, but we have be, where we have be plus past participle, and we get passive voice. And I'll have more to say about passive voice in a minute. But this would be like potatoes were eaten. All right, so form of be plus past participle gives us passive voice. We'll say more about that momentarily. And then our final auxiliary, the final one in our list, is do. And do is kind of a special auxiliary because it doesn't have a function, that sort of normal function like have or be, but it's kind of a replacement auxiliary for questions or negative statements. So for example, if I have a sentence like I am teaching and I want to turn that into a question, then I just switch around the auxiliary and the subject and I get am I teaching? So I've made a question out of it by using that auxiliary. Or if I want to make it a negative statement, if I want to negate something, then I can say, I am not teaching. But if I have a sentence like that's in either simple present or simple past tense, where I just have a verb with no auxiliary at all, so I have a sentence like, he eats potatoes. All right, so he eats potatoes, we have the verb eats. But if I want to make a question out of that, I need an auxiliary in order to make a question. And so I have to have some kind of stand-in auxiliary since I don't have an auxiliary already in the sentence. And do is the auxiliary that we use for that special case. So we would say, did he eat potatoes, or does he eat potatoes? And that would be how we do that. Or if I wanted to make it negative, you would say, he does not eat potatoes. And so in that case, it's helping me form the negative. All right, so do is kind of an all-purpose stand-in auxiliary when we don't have one of the other auxiliaries already at work. All right, this would be a good moment to take a break and look at exercises 9.1 and 9.2. So why don't you pause the video at this moment and do those exercises and check your answers, and then we'll come back in shortly. All right. Now, if we're going to talk, to wrap up our conversation about verbs, we have two more main things we need to cover. The first is mood, and then we're going to get back to the voice in a minute, like passive or active voice. So with moods, English has 4 moods. And the first mood is indicative. And indicative mood are sentences that make a statement or ask a question. So George eats potatoes makes a statement. That's indicative mood. Then our second mood is imperative. Okay, imperative. And you can kind of see the same root in here for emperor. And this is the kind of mood that makes commands, right? Like, eat your potatoes, when we're telling somebody to do something. And in that case, we leave off the subject even, and we just start with the verb, and we just say, eat your potatoes. That's imperative mood. All right, then we have our third mood is conditional. Conditional, and when we're talking about conditional mood, we're talking about sentences that set up conditions under which certain attitudes or actions will occur. So, and often we end up using modal auxiliaries to complete these kinds of sentences. So something like, if I had known you were coming, I would have baked a cake. All right, if I had known you were coming, I would have baked a cake. That's a conditional sentence where I'm setting up some kind of condition before I get to the main clause. And then the fourth mood is subjunctive. Now, the subjunctive mood has been doing its best to disappear from the English language for many, many years already, and it has pretty much all but disappeared, but there are a couple of places where we continue to maintain it. And so we're going to look at those briefly here, and then we'll talk more about subjunctive in our next session, or in a couple of sessions, I think, from now. All right, so subjunctive mood, places where we have them is in a contrary to fact statement. All right, so when we have something contrary to fact, the most famous one I can think of is in Fiddler on the Roof when he says, if I were a rich man. That if I were a rich man is in the subjunctive mood. So it's making a statement that is contrary to fact. Obviously, he is not a rich man, but he's imagining if he were. So he's making a statement contrary to fact. And so instead of saying, if I am, or if I was a rich man, he uses this form, this were form, this plural form of the be verb in order to indicate that it's in subjunctive mood. Very strange little leftover in the English language from an earlier time. So if I were king, if it were Friday, you know, all of these kinds of sentences where we put were in there to indicate that we're making a contrary to fact statement. The second place where we see subjunctive is when we have a demand or recommendation with a noun clause object beginning with that. All right, so a demand or strong recommendation that has an object that's a noun clause that begins with the word that. Now, this is very specific circumstances, and it'll take a little time to be able to recognize these when you bump into them. But here is an example of this kind of a sentence. And again, like I said, we'll come back to this in a couple of sessions and look at it more closely. But a sentence like, Jamie demanded that she be allowed to leave. All right, she demanded that she be allowed to leave. And in this case, when we're using the subjunctive, instead of having a verb that agrees with she in the that clause, in the noun clause, we have the base form of the verb be, right? So Jamie demanded that she be allowed to leave. And so if it were not subjunctive, we would say she demanded that she is allowed to leave. But we use be there because we're doing a subjunctive kind of thing. So that's subjunctive. We will, as I said, look at that in more detail when we get to chapter 11. But those are our 4 moods in English. And now we are ready to talk about our last item on our agenda for today, and that is our 2 voices. All right, 2 voices. I told you this would be verbs by the numbers. We just got numbers all the way through. But so we have 2 voices, and we have both active and passive voice. So active, an example of an active sentence, active voice sentence would be George ate potatoes. All right, George ate potatoes. We have our agent over here, our actor, who is doing something to something else. And it's just like a perfectly normal statement of some kind of a reality. Now, if I want to make this passive, then I'm going to take my object over here and I'm going to move it into the subject position. So I'm going to say potatoes. Then I'm going to need a form of the verb to be plus a past participle of the verb. And I get potatoes were eaten. Now I could add here, if I wanted to, by George. That could be added, but it's optional in this case. And what I've done in this sentence is that I've taken the object and I've made it a subject. I'm emphasizing it by putting it in the subject position. But it's still the object, sort of logically. Do you see that? Even though it's acting like a subject in this sentence, it comes before the verb, it's still logically the object of this sentence because the potatoes didn't eat themselves, right? They are being eaten by something else. And that is passive voice. When we create this kind of situation where the subject is not the actor or the agent in the situation. Now, in order to make something passive, in order to have a passive sentence, passive voice sentence, we have to have an object, right? Because if part of the operation is to move the object into the subject position, there has to be an object to start with. And this means that we can only make passive voice sentences when we have which 4 sentence patterns? Think about it a minute. Exactly. We can only make passive voice when we have sentence patterns 7, 8, 9, or 10, because those are the 4 sentence patterns that are transitive. You remember, 7, 8, 9, and 10 are all transitive verbs. And in order to have passive voice, you have to have a transitive voice because you have to have an object. Otherwise, there's no reason to make a passive voice sentence. And so this only affects those last 4 sentence patterns. So let's look at some examples with the different sentence patterns. So this sentence pattern that we used as our example here, George ate potatoes, is a sentence pattern 7. We have a verb plus an object. Very straightforward sentence pattern 7. But if I had a sentence like George gave Mary potatoes. George gave Mary potatoes. Now I've got a sentence pattern 8 because I have what he gave as my direct object, the potatoes, and then I have a recipient or beneficiary of the action who is Mary, right? Who is the indirect object. Now in this particular case, in number 8, when we have a sentence pattern 8, we can actually turn this into a passive sentence in 2 different ways. So we could say potatoes were given to Mary by George, or we could say Mary was given potatoes by George. So either way, we can turn it into a passive sentence, but we still have a sentence pattern 8 there. Then sentence pattern 9 would be something like George considers potatoes delicious. George considers potatoes delicious. And in this case, we've got an adjective out here, and we have a classic sentence pattern 9. But we can turn this one around too. We can say potatoes are considered delicious by George. Okay? And then a sentence pattern 10 would be something like George, or sorry, not George, let's start with a different subject. They elected George president. Sentence pattern 10. Got a noun over here in our object complement slot. And so if I wanted to turn this into passive, I would just say George was elected president. All right? So with any of these 4 patterns, we can have a passive version of it. And you probably remember perhaps in high school, your teacher's telling you, don't write in the passive voice, just use the active. It makes your prose more lively. And in general, that is good advice, especially if you're doing creative writing, but there are places where the passive voice is appropriate. Passive voice can be appropriate when, for example, you don't know the subject. So, if Mary's purse was stolen and we don't know exactly who stole it, then we just say Mary's purse was stolen last night. And the passive voice is perfectly acceptable there because we don't know the agent, and so we're not emphasizing the agent in that sentence. The thing is that the purse was stolen. Another case where it might be helpful to use passive voice is in certain kinds of scientific reporting. If you're reporting about some kind of an experiment that you're doing, where you're taking care of, different kinds of test subjects or something, and you want to sound like you are kind of an observer who is standing above the whole thing, kind of looking down on this experiment, then you might use the passive voice to do that, right? So, the test subjects were administered a dose of, X, Y, and Z or something, and it makes you sound a little more objective, like as a researcher, you were above it. Instead of saying in the active voice, I injected the test subjects with X, Y, and Z. And so that can be a place where the passive voice can be used. And then, a third use where you see the passive voice coming into play is in politics, when politicians say things like mistakes were made, right? And they're de-emphasizing the agent who made the mistakes by using the passive voice. All right, so those are our voices. Now let's talk about diagramming passive sentences, because we need to know how we're going to diagram a sentence when we bump into one that's passive. So here's an example of a passive sentence. The diamonds were left in the safe by the inept burglar. Okay, the diamonds were left in the safe by the inept burglar. All right, so we have a form of the verb be here plus a past participle. So we know we have passive voice here. And so when we're going to diagram this sentence, we're going to diagram it pretty much the way we've been diagramming all of our sentences so far. We're going to have the diamonds. And then we're going to put the whole verb in the verb slot. So we're going to have were left here, just like we've been doing so far. The whole verb goes there. And then in the safe, it's just a prepositional phrase, by the inept burglar. All right, so this is the way that sentence is going to look. Now, the only tricky thing about this is just diagramming the way we've been diagramming, so there's nothing that's exceptionally unusual about this. But the only thing that is tricky about this is that this looks like we've got a sentence pattern 6 here, because we have a verb with no object, right? And so it looks like sentence pattern 6. But in fact, this is not a sentence pattern 6. It is not an intransitive verb. And so when you're dealing with a passive sentence, you need to think, what is the active form of this sentence? If I look at the active form of this sentence, I would have to say, the inept burglar left the diamonds in the safe. Right? The inept burglar left the diamonds in the safe. And so in that case, what I'm dealing with then is a sentence pattern 7. He left the diamonds. There's a direct object. When it's turned around and made passive, we're still taking this passive voice into consideration here. So we consider this a sentence pattern 7, even though it looks like a sentence pattern 6. So that's something you have to be careful about when you are doing exercises that contain passive voice constructions. Let's do one more example of this just to make sure that we're clear about it. Here we have, we were given free meals by the owner of the restaurant. Okay, we were given free meals by the owner of the restaurant. So to diagram this, we're going to have we as our subject, were given, and then free meals is our object over here, free meals. And then in the prepositional phrase, we have by the owner of the restaurant. Okay, so we were given free meals by the owner of the restaurant. Now, in this case, it's tempting, again, to think that this is a sentence pattern 7. We have we as our subject. We have were given as our verb. It's a passive voice verb. And then we have free meals that looks like it's the object of the sentence. And it is the object of the sentence. But in actual fact, what we have here is a sentence pattern 8. Right? Sentence pattern 8. Because if we go back to the active form of this sentence, we would have the owner of the restaurant gave us free meals. So we then would be the indirect object, so we have a sentence pattern 8 rather than a sentence pattern 7. So whenever you bump into a passive voice construction in a sentence, sometimes it can be tricky to notice them, but if you notice that you've got a passive voice in the sentence, try turning it around and making the sentence active. And then whatever the sentence pattern of that active sentence is what the sentence pattern of the passive sentence is going to be. All right, I recommend that you do the exercises at the end of chapter 9 and practice working with these verbs. One last piece of advice, if you're trying to come up with a tense and verb aspect, what I do is I just remember that these combinations go with like progressive and perfect. So if I have be plus present participle, then that is what I need for progressive. If I have plus past participle, that's what I need for perfect, right? So if I'm going to put these all together, and let's say I ask for a future perfect progressive, then I'm going to think it through each step of the way. So if it's future, I'm going to have will. And then if I'm going to have perfect progressive, I have to have a perfect form there. So I'm going to start with have. But I'm also going to have this one coming in. And so my past participle that's going with have for the perfect is going to be been. Will have been. Then been is going to need an ing form. The present participle, eating. So I have will have been eating. So this is the future part. This is the perfect part. This is the progressive part. Now here's where things get a little crazy. I'm sorry to have to add this at the very end of the lesson, but we can make any one of these 12 tense and aspect combinations passive. So sorry to tell you that. So we can add in the be plus past participle part. Okay.